The wind howling through the concrete canyons of Chicago didn't just bite. It gnawed with a primal, icy hunger. It was a relentless predator, a gusting force that surged off Lake Michigan to find every microscopic gap in Elena's tattered wool coat, a garment that had seen better decades and was now losing its battle against the elements. She clutched 3-year-old Leo closer to her chest, pulling him into the hollow of her collarbone. She could feel the rhythmic, shallow warmth of his breath against her neck, a tiny puff of life that served as the only thing keeping her soul from freezing into a solid block of ice. They stood under the flickering, buzzing neon sign of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, a beacon of sterile, cold white light in the midnight gloom. Elena wasn't there for medicine, and she wasn't there for a checkup. She was there for the most basic of human needs: survival. The municipal shelter had reached its maximum capacity 3 hours ago, the overworked volunteer at the desk giving her nothing but a shrug and a "try again at 6 a.m." The emergency room waiting area was the only place left in the city where the air didn't turn into visible mist the moment it left her lungs. Her boots, worn so thin at the soles that she could feel the texture of the sidewalk, squeaked against the high-gloss polished linoleum as she slipped through the heavy sliding glass doors. The immediate blast of heated air was so intense it felt like a physical weight. The overwhelming smell of antiseptic, bleach, and floor wax hit her, a medicinal scent that most people associated with trauma or sickness. But to Elena, in this moment, it smelled like the gates of paradise. She moved with the practiced stealth of the invisible, finding a corner in the far back of the waiting room, cleverly hidden behind a row of molded plastic chairs and a dying, dusty potted palm. As she slowly lowered herself onto the hard floor, her joints protested with a dull, aching roar that vibrated through her bones. Leo stirred, his large, liquid brown eyes fluttering open, reflecting the harsh, unforgiving overhead fluorescence. "Are we home, Mommy?" he whispered, his voice a tiny, sandpaper rasp of exhaustion. Elena felt a sharp, jagged pain in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. "Almost, baby. Just for tonight, this is our castle," she lied, her voice trembling as she smoothed his tangled, matted hair. She reached into her bag, pulling out a crumpled, generic brand granola bar, their absolute last, and began to break it into tiny, manageable pieces, pretending she wasn't starving, so he would eat every single crumb. High above the quiet, muffled desperation of the lobby, in a glass-walled executive suite that overlooked the city's glittering, indifferent skyline, Julian Vane stood motionless. As the chief financial officer of the Vane Medical Group, his entire existence was measured in cold, hard metrics, spreadsheets, quarterly growth projections, and the ruthless efficiency of bottom lines. At 34, he was a man defined by his career, described by the financial press as architecturally handsome and emotionally vacant. He adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the glass, the oppressive silence of his office feeling heavier than usual tonight. He was technically supposed to be at a black-tie charity gala, rubbing elbows with aging donors and sipping vintage champagne. But a nagging discrepancy in the pediatric wing's budget had kept him pinned to his mahogany desk until the early hours of the morning. He grabbed his charcoal gray cashmere overcoat, ready to head to the sterile, private underground parking garage, but a sudden, uncharacteristic impulse stopped him. He bypassed the private executive elevator and took the stairs toward the main lobby instead. He felt a sudden, strange need to see the hospital he managed through the eyes of the people it actually served, rather than through the filtered data of a PowerPoint presentation. As he stepped into the peripheral shadows of the waiting room, his gaze was immediately drawn to the back corner, away from the trauma cases and the midnight fevers. He saw a woman. Her face was etched with a brand of weariness that looked permanent, a deep-seated exhaustion that went beyond a lack of sleep. She was feeding a small boy with the intense, focused devotion of a priestess performing a sacred ritual. She looked incredibly fragile, her frame narrowed by hunger. Yet there was a fierce, leonine quality to how she shielded the child from the room. Julian felt a strange, unfamiliar tug in his chest, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. He wasn't a man of many impulses, but he found himself walking toward them. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, he'd left it on his chair, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar with the sleeves rolled up. In the dim light, he looked less like a titan of industry, and more like a weary worker just finishing a long shift. Elena looked up, her heart leaping into her throat like a trapped bird, As a tall, imposing figure approached her hiding spot, she instinctively tightened her grip on Leo, pulling him into her lap, fully expecting a security guard with a stern, bureaucratic face and an order to move along to the next cold street corner. Instead, she looked up into the eyes of a man who looked unexpectedly human. He had tired eyes and a kind, if somewhat stiff, expression. He looked out of place in such a gritty setting, yet strangely approachable in his disheveled professional attire. "I'm sorry," she blurted out before he could even open his mouth, her voice sharp and defensive, the armor of the dispossessed. "We're just waiting for a ride. My cousin is coming. We'll be gone in just a minute, I promise." Julian stopped a few feet away, seeing the raw, vibrating panic in her eyes and the way she shielded the boy. He realized then, with a sudden clarity, that if he identified himself as the CFO, the man who owned the very floor she was sitting on, she would likely bolt into the freezing night or shut down entirely. "I'm not here to kick you out," he said softly, modulating his voice to a deep, steady calm. I'm a volunteer here. I usually help out with the night shift logistics and deliveries. You look like you've had a long night, and the lobby isn't the most comfortable place for a nap." Elena's shoulders dropped barely an inch, but it was a start. A volunteer. Someone who chose to be here in the middle of the night. "I'm Elena," she said, her grip on Leo loosening just a fraction. "And this is Leo. We just needed to get out of the wind. It's brutal out there tonight." Julian looked at the thin, crumpled granola bar wrapper on the floor, and then at the boy's pale, translucent cheeks. "The cafeteria just finished a fresh batch of soup for the night staff," he lied effortlessly, a skill he usually reserved for hostile board takeovers. "It's going to go to waste if someone doesn't eat it. Would you and the little guy mind helping me out so it doesn't get thrown away?" The hospital cafeteria was a cavernous, echoing space, nearly empty at 2 a.m. except for the occasional hum of a vending machine. Julian led them to a booth in the far corner, tucked away from the prying eyes of the late-night cleaning crew and the security cameras he knew were monitored in the basement. He told them to wait and disappeared into the kitchen area. Using his master keycard, he bypassed the closed registers and personally prepared a tray. He didn't bring back meager leftovers. He brought 2 large, steaming bowls of thick chicken noodle soup, heavy with vegetables and meat, along with several slices of crusty buttered bread and a cold carton of organic milk for Leo. He sat across from them, watching in a strange, quiet fascination as Elena tried to eat slowly. She was clearly trying to maintain a shred of her former dignity, refusing to inhale the food despite the fact that her hands were shaking. She broke the bread into small pieces for Leo first, blowing on his soup to ensure it wasn't too hot, making sure the child was fully attended to before she took more than a single sip of her own broth. "You're very good with him," Julian remarked, sipping a black coffee he had grabbed just to have something in his hands. Elena looked up, a faint, rosy flush appearing on her high cheekbones from the heat of the soup. "He's everything I have left, Julian. His father, he was gone before the sonogram was even dry. Then, the textile factory where I worked closed down, and the landlord didn't care about economic downturns. It's a fast slide down, Mr. Julian," he provided quickly, cutting her off before she could reach for a last name. "Just Julian." She nodded, a small, sad, and hauntingly beautiful smile touching her lips. "I used to be a teacher's aide, Julian. I liked books. I liked the way a classroom felt in the quiet morning before the kids arrived, the smell of pencils and potential. Now, I just like the way a building feels when it's heated above 60 degrees. Julian felt a sudden, violent surge of indignation, not at her, but at the entire system he helped maintain, a system that saw numbers, assets, and liabilities instead of human beings like Elena. As the warmth of the heavy, nourishing food and the stable temperature of the room took hold, Leo's tiny body finally surrendered. The adrenaline that keeps a child of the streets awake had dissolved, replaced by the overwhelming weight of physical exhaustion. He curled up on the cracked burgundy vinyl seat of the cafeteria booth, his small head resting heavily on Elena's lap. Seeing the boy shiver slightly in his sleep, Julian didn't hesitate. He reached over the back of the booth and handed her his expensive charcoal cashmere overcoat. Elena hesitated for a second, recognizing the sheer quality of the fabric, before she draped it over the boy. It swallowed him like a heavy woolen sanctuary. the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain clinging to the fibers. The conversation between the two adults deepened, moving past the superficialities of the night. The hospital around them settled into its deepest graveyard shift lull, the rhythmic hum of the vending machines and the distant, muffled squeak of a janitor's mop becoming their only soundtrack. Elena's voice was a low, melodic rasp as she began to pull back the curtain on the invisible life she had been living. She spoke with a brutal, poetic honesty about the hurdles of the Chicago shelter system, the jarring, constant noise of dozens of people breathing and coughing in a single room, the predatory threat of theft that meant she had to sleep with her bag strapped to her chest, and the total, crushing loss of privacy. "The worst part isn't even the cold," she whispered, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking Leo's hair. "It's the way people look through you. You become a ghost while you're still breathing. You see the pity in some eyes, but mostly you just see the way they pivot their gaze to avoid acknowledging you're made of the same flesh and blood as they are." Julian listened with an intensity he usually reserved for high-stakes, multi-million-dollar contracts. He felt a profound sense of shame at his own previous blindness. He found himself telling her stories about his own work, carefully omitting the titles of power, describing the soul-crushing stress of a man who had become a cog in a massive corporate machine. He spoke of the isolation of the top floor and the heavy, suffocating responsibility of keeping an institution afloat while losing the faces of the people inside the buildings. Then, moved by her vulnerability, Julian opened a door he had kept locked for over a decade. He spoke of his own mother, a fierce immigrant woman who had scrubbed floors in buildings just like this one, working 3 grueling jobs to ensure her son could sit in classrooms at an Ivy League school. It was a memory he usually kept buried beneath layers of professional ambition and cold efficiency. "She would have liked you," Julian said, his voice thick with a raw, unexpected emotion that surprised even him. "She always told me that the strongest people in the world aren't the ones who never fall, but the ones who manage to make a home in the ruins of what they lost. She called it building from the ashes." Elena looked at him, her gaze searching his face with an intelligence that made him feel more exposed than he ever had in a boardroom. "Why are you being so kind to us, Julian? Most volunteers just give you a scratchy, thin blanket and a list of disconnected phone numbers that nobody ever picks up. Why are you still sitting here?" Julian looked down at his cooling coffee, seeing his own reflection in the black liquid. "Maybe I'm tired of the lists, Elena. Maybe I just wanted to see a person's eyes tonight instead of their file. I think I needed this conversation more than you needed the soup." The first rays of a gray, somber Chicago dawn began to bleed through the high industrial cafeteria windows, turning the sterile, white-tiled room into a pale, watery blue. The harsh reality of the coming day began to set in like a cold front moving across the lake. Outside, the city was waking up. The distant roar of the L train could be heard, and inside, nurses were changing shifts with the sharp clatter of clipboards and the smell of fresh, bitter coffee. Soon, the volunteer would be expected to transform back into the CFO for a 9 a.m. board meeting regarding cost-cutting measures in the emergency department. Julian looked at the woman across from him, now silhouetted by the morning light, and felt a sudden, sharp certainty that he would not let her walk back out through those sliding glass doors into the freezing wind with nothing but a bowl of soup in her stomach and a temporary reprieve from the cold. "Elena, listen to me very carefully," he began, leaning forward across the laminate table, his voice urgent and low. "The hospital has a specialized transitional housing program. It's a series of units designed for families in unique, temporary situations where safety is a concern." This was a creative half-truth. The program existed on the hospital's books, but it was currently a dormant project, tied up in bureaucratic red tape and funding disputes between departments, disputes he realized he had the power to settle with a single phone call. "I can get you and Leo a room there today. It's safe, it's private, and it's heated. There's a kitchen and a bed. It's yours for as long as it takes to get you back on your feet." Elena's eyes filled with tears, a single crystalline drop escaping and trailing down her tired cheek, but her jaw set in a firm line of pride. She shook her head firmly. "I can't just take charity like that, Julian. I've spent months fighting every single day to keep my head up and my dignity intact. I don't want a handout that can be taken away on a whim. I need a job. I need to earn our way so that no one, Not a landlord, not a social worker, can ever tell me I don't belong where I'm standing. Julian felt a surge of respect that bordered on awe. He smiled, a genuine warm expression that completely shattered his normally stoic professional mask. I was hoping you'd say that. I happen to know for a fact that the Administrative and Patient Services Department is looking for someone with an education background to handle patient records and family outreach. It's a difficult, emotionally demanding job, but it pays a living wage and includes benefits. Would you be willing to interview for it? Today? The transition from the gritty reality of the street to the sterile luxury of the executive floor felt like crossing between two different dimensions. Just 3 hours earlier, Elena had been a woman defined by her invisibility. Now she was a woman on a mission. The hot shower in the staff locker room had been transformative, the steam washing away layers of grime and the lingering scent of damp pavement. Wrapped in a borrowed set of crisp, navy blue hospital scrubs provided by a sympathetic night nurse named Maria, Elena felt a strange, electric sense of renewal. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. The hollows of her cheeks were still there, but her eyes held a spark of the fire that had once burned so brightly. She navigated the labyrinthine hallways with Leo's hand in hers until she reached the bank of executive elevators. The ride up to the penthouse was silent and swift, making her stomach drop. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a world of quiet, absolute power. The reception area was a masterpiece of architectural minimalism. Glass walls, brushed steel accents, and deep, plush carpeting that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. Original modern art hung on the walls, and the furniture looked more like high-priced sculpture than something meant for sitting. At the center of this temple of commerce sat an executive secretary, a woman in a sharp, slate-gray suit who radiated professional composure. However, when she looked up and saw Elena in her borrowed scrubs, her composure cracked. A look of blatant, wide-eyed shock crossed her face as she processed the contrast between the environment and the visitor. "I'm here to see Julian," Elena said. Her voice started as a small, shaky thread, but gained strength as she stood taller. For the interview he mentioned in the cafeteria. The secretary hesitated, her eyes darting to her computerized calendar, and then back to the disheveled but determined woman before her. "Mr. Vane, he canceled his 9:30 a.m. board meeting to wait for you," the secretary whispered, her tone shifting from skepticism to a strange kind of awe. "He's been expecting you. Please, follow me." As Elena walked into the massive corner office, the sheer scale of the room made her breath hitch. The walls were entirely glass, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the Chicago skyline, the very city she had been sleeping on the streets of just hours before. Standing by the window was the man from the cafeteria, but the volunteer was gone. In his place stood a titan of industry, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal blue three-piece suit that fit him like armor. He looked every bit the powerful CFO the financial papers described. He turned to face her, standing behind a sprawling mahogany desk that was polished to a mirror shine. On the wall behind him, a heavy brass plaque caught a beam of morning light. Julian Vane, Chief Financial Officer. Elena froze in the doorway, the air leaving her lungs in a painful rush. The realization felt like a physical blow to the chest. "You're not a volunteer," she whispered, her voice trembling with a volatile mix of betrayal, shame, and sudden, blinding anger. Julian walked around the desk, his movements deliberate and calm. "I wasn't lying about the work, Elena. I do volunteer my time and my life to this hospital. Every single hour I'm in this building. I just happen to be the man who makes sure the doors stay open. I just happen to be the one who signs the checks." "Why did you trick me?" Elena asked, her voice rising as her old, defensive pride surged. Her fingers gripped the strap of her bag so hard her knuckles turned white, the cheap faux leather cracking under the pressure. She felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sensation that the floor might open up and swallow her. The suspicion that had been her armor for months flared up. She feared she was nothing more than a social experiment for a billionaire who wanted to feel a fleeting sense of virtue. Was this a game, to see how the other half lives? Did you go home to your mansion feeling proud that you fed a homeless woman and her son a bowl of hospital soup? Julian stopped several feet away, sensing her urge to flee back toward the elevator. He didn't reach out. He kept his hands visible, open and non-threatening. His expression softened, the hard lines of the executive fading to reveal the man she had shared a booth with in the dark of night. "Because if I had told you I was the CFO last night, you never would have sat down," he said, his voice carrying an earnestness that cut through her anger like a blade through silk. "You would have seen the suit, the title, and the power. You wouldn't have eaten that soup. You wouldn't have told me about the way you used to love the quiet of a classroom or the crushing weight of being looked through by strangers. I didn't want to be a benefactor, Elena. I needed to be a person. I needed you to see the man, not the position. I needed that moment of truth as much as you did." He reached back to his mahogany desk and picked up a thick blue leather folder. "I spent the entire morning making calls. I've already cleared the transitional housing unit. And I didn't just sign a paper. I ensured it was ready. It's not a shelter, Elena. It's a small, fully furnished apartment on the 4th floor of the hospital annex. It has a real kitchen, a bedroom for Leo with a view of the park, and most importantly, a door with a key that belongs only to you. It's yours for as long as you need to find your footing." He stepped closer, holding out the folder. "And the job offer? That's not a favor or a whim. While you were in the shower, I pulled your old employment records from the school district. You were one of their highest-rated aides before the budget cuts. We have a crisis in this hospital. We have people who come in here every day who are terrified, confused, and feeling discarded by the world. We need someone who actually understands the human cost of being on the outside. We need your heart, your resilience, and your perspective, Elena. I'm not looking for a clerk. I'm looking for a leader." Elena looked at the folder, then at the sprawling, indifferent city outside the glass walls. For the first time in years, the streets didn't look like a labyrinth of dangers designed to swallow her whole. They looked like a map she finally had the keys to navigate. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice cracking as the first real sob of relief threatened to break through her chest. "I'm so tired of fighting, Julian. I don't know if I have any fight left." "You already did the hard part," Julian said softly, his voice a steady, unbreakable anchor. "You survived the world at its absolute worst. Now, you just have to give yourself permission to learn how to live again. Let us help you carry the weight for a while. You don't have to be a soldier today." The following 6 months were a whirlwind of radical, soul-deep change that often felt like a fever dream, a vivid blur of colors and comforts that Elena had long ago convinced herself were gone forever. Elena and Leo moved into the apartment in the hospital annex, a transition that felt like stepping out of a black-and-white film into a world of vibrant technicolor. To Julian, who was accustomed to sprawling penthouses with private elevators and marble floors, it was a modest, functional space. But to Elena, it was a sanctuary of impossible, breathtaking luxury. She spent the first week in a state of quiet, reverent shock. She would often stand in the small kitchen just staring at the stove, marveling at the steady blue flame that bloomed at her command. The simple ability to boil water for tea or cook a warm meal for her son whenever she wanted, without seeking permission or hiding in the shadows, brought her to tears more often than the cold ever had. The bed was a revelation. It featured a thick mattress and fresh, high thread count sheets that smelled of lavender and sun-dried cotton. For the first time since Leo was born, she slept through the night with both eyes closed, the heavy oak door standing guard like a silent sentinel between them and the harsh, indifferent world outside. Elena didn't just take the job Julian offered. She revolutionized the very concept of patient care. Her natural empathy, honed by the fires of her own struggle and the grit of the streets, allowed her to connect with patients in a way no Ivy League administrator could ever replicate. She became known throughout the halls of St. Jude's as the heart of the hospital. She didn't just file papers, she advocated for the forgotten. When a single mother would walk into the ER with a sick child and no insurance, her eyes wide with the same panic Elena once felt, Elena didn't hand her a cold, bureaucratic form. She would sit with her, hold her trembling hand, and translate the terrifying, clinical language of medical billing into a plan of action and a message of profound hope. She built bridges between the massive, sterile institution and the community it had long overlooked, turning cold account numbers back into human names. Leo, too, underwent a miraculous transformation. In the hospital's daycare center, under the watchful eyes of teachers who adored him, He blossomed like a flower in spring. The sallow hollows in his cheeks filled out with healthy color, and his skin took on a vibrant, sun-kissed glow. His infectious, bubbling laughter became a common, welcome sound in the sterile hallways, often drawing genuine, weary smiles from the most exhausted surgeons on their way to life-saving procedures. He no longer pulled at Elena's sleeve to ask if they were home yet. He simply knew he was safe. He had a toy box, a favorite blanket, and the certainty of a breakfast waiting for him every morning. Julian, meanwhile, found his own life shifting on its axis in ways he never predicted. The emotionally vacant CFO the financial press had mocked was a ghost of the past. He spent less time staring at profit margins in his glass-walled office, and more time walking the wards, actually listening to the nurses, the janitors, and the patients. He began to understand that a hospital's true success wasn't measured in the black ink of a ledger, but in the lives restored and the dignity preserved. He visited the annex often, usually bringing a new, colorful picture book for Leo or a specialized calming tea for Elena. He always claimed he was just checking on the facility's structural maintenance, but the entire staff saw through the facade. They knew the titan of industry was there to see the woman who had rediscovered his soul for him. One evening, as they walked through the hospital's rooftop garden, the air was crisp but no longer threatening. While Leo chased a monarch butterfly among the urban flora and manicured hedges, Elena turned to Julian. The sunset was painting the sprawling Chicago skyline in shades of bruised purple and liquid, molten gold. "You saved us, Julian. I don't think I've said it enough. You changed the very trajectory of our lives. You gave my son a future." Julian shook his head slowly, his gaze lingering on the newfound peace etched into the lines of her face, a peace he had helped build stone by stone. "No, Elena. You have it backward. You reminded me why I wanted to be in this business in the first place. I was becoming a ghost in a very expensive suit, counting coins while real people suffered in my lobby. You gave me back my own humanity. You saved me from a life that was successful on paper, but entirely devoid of a soul." 1 year to the day since that freezing, desperate night, when Elena had huddled behind a dusty, neglected palm tree in the St. Jude's lobby, the city of Chicago witnessed a different kind of gathering. The St. Jude's annual gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Blackstone Hotel, a cavernous space of staggering, blinding opulence, where the gilded ceilings, intricately carved with golden leaf, seemed to reach for the heavens. The air inside was thick, almost intoxicating, with the scent of 5,000 imported white lilies and the lingering, expensive trails of designer perfumes that cost more than a year's rent in the suburbs. The city's elite, powerful politicians with forced smiles, ruthless CEOs in $1,000 shoes, and guarded socialites draped in diamonds, moved through the room in a rhythmic sea of black tuxedos and shimmering silk gowns. In years past, Julian Vane would have been the most unreachable man in this room, a cold, marble statue checking his platinum watch every 10 minutes, calculating the earliest possible moment he could slip away to the sterile solitude of his penthouse. But tonight, Julian wasn't looking for the exit. He stood in the center of the fray, his posture relaxed for the first time in a decade, his gaze anchored with magnetic intensity to the woman at his side. Beside him stood Elena, radiant and breathtaking, in a stunning midnight blue silk dress. The fabric had a subtle, celestial shimmer, matching the deep, mysterious color of the Chicago night sky, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her transformation was not just aesthetic, it was spiritual. Her confidence and poise were a testament to an incredible journey of reclaimed dignity. She carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had looked into the absolute abyss of human suffering and refused to blink. When she spoke to the hospital's board members, she did so as their peer, a respected leader who had turned the family support division from a footnote into the hospital's most successful and emotionally resonant initiative. The highlight of the evening arrived when the crystal chandeliers dimmed to a soft amber glow. Julian took the stage to introduce the keynote speaker. His voice didn't carry the usual corporate frost. It was warm, vibrating with a pride that was almost tangible to everyone in the room. As Elena walked up the steps to the podium, framed by heavy crimson velvet curtains and the hushed, curious expectations of the city's wealthiest donors, she carried no notes. She didn't use a teleprompter, nor did she rely on the polished, sanitized script a PR firm had tried to hand her earlier that afternoon. She stood before the microphone, her eyes scanning the room, and for a long moment, The silence was absolute. She didn't talk about quarterly statistics, beds occupied, or market share growth. Instead, she spoke about the invisible people. With a voice that was steady and filled with raw, moving honesty, she described the biting, metallic taste of the wind on Michigan Avenue and the way a mother's heart physically breaks when she has to lie to her child about where they will sleep. She spoke of the children who think a hospital lobby is a castle simply because the air inside doesn't turn into mist when they breathe. Dignity, she told the hushed crowd, her voice echoing off the gilded walls, is not something we grant to people out of the goodness of our hearts. It is something we recognize in them because it was always there. A year ago, I was a ghost in Julian's lobby, a shadow you would have walked past without a second thought. Tonight, I am a voice. The only difference between those two versions of me is that one person decided to look past the rags and the shame to see the human being beneath. Her words silenced the clinking of silverware and the cynical whispers of the back tables. She told them that true wealth was a sacred responsibility to the vulnerable, not just a high score on a financial ledger. When she finished, the silence lingered for a heartbeat, a heavy, pregnant pause, before exploding into a thunderous standing ovation that lasted for 5 full minutes. That night, the elite didn't just clap. They opened their checkbooks with a collective fervor the hospital had never seen in its century-long history. The donations were unprecedented, totaling enough to fund 3 new permanent transitional housing units and a state-of-the-art mobile clinic that would bring life-saving healthcare directly to the city's forgotten tent cities. When she finally returned to the table, her heart still racing from the adrenaline and the sheer weight of her own words, Julian reached beneath the heavy white linen cloth and took her hand. His thumb grazed her knuckles in a silent, steady gesture of overwhelming adoration. "You know," he whispered into her ear, leaning close so the scent of her perfume, delicate notes of jasmine and rain, could eclipse the antiseptic memories of their first encounter. "I've had dinner with presidents and sat at the finest tables in Paris, but I still remember the exact smell of that cafeteria chicken soup. It remains the best meal of my life because it was the night I finally woke up from a long, cold sleep." Elena laughed, a rich, soulful sound that was pure music to his ears, a sound that finally and permanently erased the echoes of her desperate, panicked whispers from a year ago. "And I still remember thinking you were the world's most tired, incompetent volunteer. I remember watching you struggle with the soup ladle and wondering how a man so bad at finding extra napkins could survive the night. I thought for sure you'd be fired by morning, Julian. I was actually worried for your job security." "I was tired," Julian admitted, his eyes locking onto hers with a depth of love that needed no executive title, spreadsheet, or legal contract to define. "I was exhausted from a life that had no purpose, no pulse. I was a stranger wandering my own halls until I met you. You were the first person to actually see me, Elena. Not the CFO, not the money. Just the man who was just as lost as anyone else." As the orchestra began to play a slow, sweeping waltz, Julian led Elena to the center of the dance floor. Under the glow of 1,000 crystals, surrounded by the most powerful people in the city, the man who once had everything and the woman who once had nothing moved in perfect rhythmic harmony. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes as they swayed to the music. She knew that their story wasn't just a fairy tale, it was a blueprint. It was proof that even in the coldest, most indifferent city, a little warmth and the courage to truly see someone's pain could change the world forever. And miles away, high above the bustling streets and the quiet, heated safety of their home, Leo was fast asleep. He wasn't dreaming of the biting wind, the hard plastic chairs, or the taste of a crumpled, dry granola bar. He was tucked under a soft, hand-stitched quilt, dreaming of a tomorrow that was finally, beautifully, and permanently certain. The boy who once asked if they were home yet finally had his answer. They weren't just home. They were loved, they were seen, and they were finally, truly safe.